Elara McGregor knew the smell of the sea better than the sound of a city bus. Growing up on the west coast of Scotland, in a tiny village where the hills rolled down to the slate-grey loch and the air was always heavy with salt and heather, her life was predictable and beautiful, a comforting rhythm of fishing boats and sheep calls. But the predictability, she realized on the cusp of her 23rd birthday, was also a cage. She yearned for noise, for concrete, for the kind of anonymity only a capital city could offer. After 2 years of saving every pound from her work at the local tea room, she finally booked her week-long escape to Edinburgh. The moment she stepped off the train at Waverley Station, the contrast hit her like a physical force. The city was a magnificent theatrical tangle of Gothic architecture and bustling life. She saw the castle looming over the old town, a dark, stony sentinel, and felt a surge of freedom she'd never known. She wandered the Royal Mile, the scent of fudge and ancient stone in the air, and explored the warren of closes and winds, soaking up the history that seemed to cling to every cobblestone. This was where her new life would begin, even if just for 7 days. The attention-grabbing moment, the one that broke the quiet rhythm of her coastal existence, happened on Tuesday afternoon. She was sitting in a small, tucked-away cafe near Victoria Street, sketching the curve of the buildings in her notebook when he walked in. Liam. He was all sleek, city elegance, sharp suit, dark, tailored coat, and eyes the colour of the Forth when the sun hit the water just right. He apologized for brushing past her chair, and the apology morphed effortlessly into conversation. He was charismatic, quick-witted, and seemed genuinely fascinated by her small-town life. He worked in a new town gallery, he said, surrounded by beauty, but rarely finding any that felt real. He was captivated by the mist and silence she described. They spent the next 5 days together, a dizzying head-over-heels courtship that felt like a movie. They climbed Arthur's Seat at dawn, the wind whipping their hair as the city woke below them, and he held her hand so tightly she felt utterly secure. They shared cheap wine in dimly lit bars in Leith and talked for hours about art, history, and the future they suddenly both envisioned. The intensity was intoxicating, blurring the edges of a few concerning details. The way he drained his glass too fast, the quick flash of defensiveness when she asked about his family, and the sudden, chilling mood shifts after a third drink. But Elara dismissed it all. He was passionate. He was complex. This was love, real city-bred love, not the simple, predictable kind back home. By Friday, standing under the shadow of the castle, Liam took her hand, his eyes shining with an urgency that thrilled her, and asked her to stay, to marry him. She didn't hesitate. She said yes, abandoning her return ticket and the quiet life she'd planned to escape. Elara viewed their impending marriage not just as a union of two souls, but as an ascension, a definitive escape from the narrow confines of her village. She pictured a life of elegant sophistication, evenings spent attending gallery openings and theatre in the new town, engaging in witty, intellectually stimulating conversations over fine wine, and effortlessly navigating Edinburgh's bustling cultural scene as Liam's polished wife. This marriage would be modern, a partnership built on shared ambition and artistic appreciation, miles away from the quiet, dutiful marriages of her coastal home, where happiness was measured by a steady boat and a full pantry. Marrying Liam was the key to unlocking the refined, successful woman she felt she was meant to be. The city, with its promise of limitless opportunity and glamour, was her true destination. They agreed to marry back in her village, a concession to her mother, and then returned to Edinburgh to build their life. The wedding, 5 weeks later, was a glorious contradiction. It was held in the tiny stone church near the loch, with the whole village turning out to see Elara, their local girl, marry the handsome man from the capital. Liam looked impossibly dashing, his city friends appearing sophisticated, yet slightly out of place against the backdrop of ancient granite and rough tweed. Elara's mother wept quiet, happy tears. They exchanged vows that spoke of eternal commitment and shared dreams, and Elara truly believed them. The reception was a blur of Keyleth dancing and toasts, Liam smiling, drinking a little too much, but always keeping his charm intact. The first cracks, small and unnerving, appeared during the journey back to Edinburgh. Liam was irritable, demanding silence, and dismissing her attempts at conversation with a sharp edge she hadn't heard before. It was just post-wedding stress, she told herself. But the true collapse began the moment they crossed the threshold of his small, stylish Newington flat, a place that quickly became the stage for their undoing. The forever lasted 5 months, each week chipping away at Elara's sanity and self-worth. Liam's alcohol dependency was not a hidden monster. It was the foundation of his personality. The witty, sharp curator she had married dissolved almost immediately, replaced by a ghost, fueled by cheap whiskey and profound self-loathing. The subtle signs she had ignored became daily battles. The instability in their home was palpable, a constant, low-level thrum of anxiety. He would wake up remorseful and loving, promising to moderate, perhaps even cut back. He'd spend the morning making grand plans for their future, plans that momentarily rekindled the hope she desperately needed to survive. But by 3 in the afternoon, the craving would start, a shadow darkening his eyes, and the promises would crumble. The flat, once a symbol of their exciting new life, became a physical representation of their decay. Unwashed glasses piled up like glassy monuments to lost evenings. The air was thick with stale alcohol, and the unspoken resentment that settled between them like dust. Elara began to dread the sound of the key in the lock, never knowing which version of her husband would walk through the door, the charming phantom or the bitter bully. She started measuring time not by days but by the space between Liam's drinks, the brief, fragile mornings when he was lucid, followed by the long, dreadful descent into the evening. His true weak character only surfaced when he was drunk, and it was devastating. Sobriety masked a man terrified of failure. Drink made him cruel and manipulative, deflecting all his personal guilt onto Elara. If she questioned his missed shifts at the gallery, he didn't apologize. He attacked. "You don't understand the pressure. You're so simple, living that easy little life of yours. You think art just happens," he would sneer, his voice heavy with alcohol and contempt, using her small-town heritage as a weapon. His aggression was rarely physical, but it was relentless, a psychological battering ram. He would gaslight her, twisting her concern into an accusation of control. "You're trying to cage me, Elara. You want me to be like those dull, dependable fishermen you grew up with. But I'm not that small." He would disappear for hours, sometimes an entire night, leaving her alone with the phone ringing. His furious boss, her worried mother, forcing Elara to lie, to cover for his cowardice, further isolating her. She felt herself shrinking, her vibrant, coastal energy replaced by a frantic need to remain invisible. The financial strain was intense. The rent went unpaid for 2 months, his gallery wages ceased, and they were surviving on the small savings Elara had brought from the coast. When she finally confronted him about selling some of his less important art pieces to pay the bills, he became hysterically furious, accusing her of being materialistic and common. "You're tarnishing beauty with your peasant mentality," he screamed, his face a mottled, unfamiliar mask. Elara found herself walking on perpetual eggshells, analyzing every word, every silence, trying to preempt the next explosion. Her simple, grounded nature was utterly destroyed by the sheer toxicity and complexity of his disease, and the character deficit it amplified. She realized with chilling clarity that the charming man she met was merely a performance, one that required alcohol to maintain until the facade completely cracked. The final catastrophic break came on a bitter, blustery October night, after 3 straight days of Liam being locked in a depressive, drunken stupor. Elara, having found an empty bottle hidden in a shoe, felt a cold final resolve. She placed the bottle on the table. "Liam," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "you are sick. You need help, and if you won't get it, I can't stay here." He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and vacant. Then the emptiness was replaced by a ferocious, liquid malice. This time the aggression was absolute. He lunged across the room, not to strike her, but to assert dominance with brutal words. "Sick? I'm sick of you. You think you're better than me? You came from a damp hole in the ground, and you think you can lecture me, the one paying for this flat?" He began listing her perceived flaws, her family's poverty, her lack of city sophistication, twisting every single kind gesture she had ever made into a manipulative scheme. He used his weakest points, his financial problems, his failed career, and furiously blamed her for them, projecting his shame onto her until she felt contaminated. He swept his arm across the coffee table, sending a glass crashing to the floor, the sound sharp and final. "Get out!" he roared, the sound tearing through the apartment. "Go back to your damp little rocks and your sheep. Take your simple morality and get out. You don't belong here." In a blind, terrifying rage, fueled by self-pity and whiskey, he grabbed the few tokens of her coastal life, her purse, her mobile phone, and the thick wool coat she'd worn from home, and tossed them violently into the hallway. "That's it. That's all you get. Get out and don't come back." Stunned, tears freezing on her cheeks, Elara was pushed out onto the cold stone landing in the middle of the night. Her wedding ring, still on her finger, felt like a shackle of burning ice, mocking her devotion. She had nothing else. No keys, no money beyond the £20 in her purse, and just the clothes she wore, a thin jumper and jeans. The wind howled outside, a desolate sound mirroring the vacuum in her soul. She walked for hours, numb and directionless. On the train, she stared at her reflection, seeing not the confident girl who arrived in Edinburgh, but a haunted, defeated stranger. The majestic hills, which had looked so beautiful from the city's vantage point, now looked intimidatingly vast, a silent audience to her failure. She didn't just return home, she retreated, bearing the psychological scars of gaslighting and sustained verbal abuse. The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the castle stone, until the first hint of grey light appeared, and she realized her only path was backward. She reached the station just as the ticket office opened, bought the cheapest single ticket she could find, and boarded the first northbound train. As the train pulled out of the city, carrying her away from the ruins of her 5-month marriage and the toxic aggression of a man with a shattered character, she didn't look back at the looming majesty of Edinburgh. She only saw the reflection of a painful truth she had to own. That true strength lay not in glamour, but in choosing safety. The journey was endless, each mile taking her further from the sophisticated lies she had bought into and closer to the harsh, comforting truth of home. When she finally arrived, broken and exhausted, her mother met her with a hug that required no explanation. There was no judgment, only warmth and the smell of peat smoke. The next few months were a slow, painful process of thawing out. Elara returned to her old job, serving tourists tea and scones, but this time the predictability was a balm, not a cage. The stability of the mundane was her anchor. Her mother's quiet acceptance and the familiar faces of the villagers provided the space she needed to heal. She filed for divorce, a transaction handled almost entirely by a kind, efficient solicitor, and gradually the shame faded into a quiet, determined resilience. She learned to appreciate the simple act of waking up to the gentle rain, knowing she was safe. It was at the village's annual summer fete, 9 months after her return, that she saw Callum MacLeod. Callum had been 2 grades ahead of her in the village school, a quiet, strong boy who now worked with his father in the Forestry Commission. He had the same easy smile and kind eyes she remembered, only now his hands were calloused from work and his shoulders broader. He'd heard the rumours, of course, everyone in the village had, but he didn't pity her or pry. He just saw Elara. He asked if she'd like a cup of tea, and they talked about the weather, the declining fishing yield, and how the hills had changed since they were kids. It was the easiest conversation she'd had in a year. Their connection grew slowly, steadily, like the moss on the ancient stones nearby. Callum was the opposite of Liam, stable, sober, and utterly honest. He showed up when he said he would, remembered the small details, and most importantly, he listened. He was like the tide, predictable, enduring, and powerful in its quiet way. Their conversations were full of space for her to speak and for him to genuinely hear. He didn't try to fill the silence with grand pronouncements. He simply existed, solid and reliable. It wasn't love at first sight, but trust at first sight, a slow, gentle blossoming that valued respect above passion. They started taking long walks along the shoreline, the place where Elara had always sought solace. One evening, as the sun dipped below the Atlantic horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and soft purples, they stopped on a small, secluded stretch of sand. The air was cool and clean. Callum turned to her, his gaze steady and kind, and he didn't need to ask permission. He simply took her hand, a gesture of quiet protection and genuine affection. He told her she was the strongest woman he knew to have walked away from the city and come home. He told her he'd always thought she was special, even back when they were just kids running wild near the docks. That night, under the immense star-dusted canopy of the rural sky, Callum kissed her. It was not the dizzying, urgent passion of the city, but a deep, grounding kiss that felt like coming home. It felt safe, it felt real. A year later, Elara stood with Callum, not in the big city that had broken her, but in the heart of her village, the place that had healed her. They bought a small cottage with a view of the loch and a big garden. She continued to work at the tea room, and Callum continued his work in the forest, their lives intertwined in a simple, honest tapestry. The scars of Edinburgh remained, a reminder of the glittering deceit she had escaped, but now they were only a backdrop to the quiet, unshakable happiness she had built. She had chased excitement and glamour, only to find true love was found in the steady gaze of a good man, the familiar smell of the sea, and the simple, enduring warmth of her home. The coastal mist was no longer a cage, it was a blanket, and she was finally safe within it.